If you have an LLC and you're conducting business in multiple states, this podcast might be for you. I'm going to talk about what foreign qualification is, defining, conducting, or doing business in another state, and why you may need to register your LLC in other states. And to wrap that up, what the penalties might be for if you don't follow through with this. I'm Jessica, a CPA from the Facts, Figures, and Fallacies podcast, and I'm here with Mitzi and Nick, also experts in this field. So we're just going to dive right on in. I'm going to start with what is foreign qualification.
And Jessica, you said foreign qualification, and when I think I'm a foreign LLC, I think of an LLC outside of the United States.
So that is confusing. It sounds misleading. However, if you, for example, have an LLC in Texas, you are considered a foreign entity to any state outside of Texas because you're not registered there. When you set up your LLC, you probably registered, well, you didn't probably, you registered with the Secretary of State of Texas. So that LLC is not recognized in any other state. You're considered foreign and not necessarily allowed to operate there and maintain the integrity of your LLC unless you comply with their regulations.
And a common thing that we actually see would be people that think that they're being savvy and they set up an LLC in Delaware. But then maybe they're actually located in Texas and they're operating in Texas. Well, then you have to register in Texas, which totally defeats the entire purpose of whatever you were trying to do by registering your LLC in Delaware.
Right. And sometimes we see, okay, I live in the state of Texas, I own real estate in Florida, but I want a Delaware LLC.
Right. So that you can do that. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, but you're just creating more work, basically. You have to create the LLC in Delaware. You have to register in Florida and register in Texas. And when I say register, not only do you have to register with their state, you have to appoint a registered agent, which is typically an additional fee, so that they can accept legal proceedings or anything on your behalf in that state.
And so registering in Texas, for example, would create the need to file the annual Texas franchise tax report.
Right.
And each state that you're registered in is generally going to have some type of franchise tax report or some type of filing requirements.
And then some of those can be very significant, like the state of California.
Right. In California, the minimum fee to have an LLC is $800 a year. Whereas in Texas, you can pay $0 per year as long as you're filing on time. Your revenue is below a certain threshold.
Right. So that is something to consider if you are going to operate in these other states, your additional fees. So in California, $800, that's not a typical fee. And if you don't keep up with it, it is costly to terminate in California as well.
Right, and very difficult to get that executed. And so when you say the state you're doing business in, can you explain what you're talking about? What is conducting business?
There's a simple way to put it. You just have to follow their rules. And that is like whatever they consider conducting business, those are the rules you have to follow. So what's not simple about it, though, is every state is different. Different things trigger whether you're operating or not in that state. And then doing business in those states may also trigger you to comply with their state tax laws as well. And a common occurrence is states don't actually list what it is that qualifies you as conducting business. They'll list activities that aren't considered conducting business. So if you have an entity and you either sell something or provide a service, you can go look through that state's laws and see if it is or isn't included in there. Typically, they leave it up to the court system to decide, based on all facts and circumstances, whether or not you are truly conducting business in that state.
So, Jessica, when you say that if you're conducting business in a state, let's say I have an office in the state of Texas, maybe I'm in oil and gas and I'm leasing equipment to New Mexico, maybe I'm leasing equipment in Louisiana, how would I know if I need to register in those states?
So you would need to consult your CPA, but in this particular instance, maybe Louisiana has a rule that if it's one isolated transaction, you aren't required to register because it's not officially conducting business. So you may be fine in that sense. However, if you have a recurring transaction and you have several contracts going in that states for leasing, that may trigger you to be required to register. So the definition of conducting or doing business, basically it depends on the state. Whatever that state's rules are, you need to follow it. It's not typically based on volume of transactions, like say maybe sales tax, but it is, again, different for each state. So a lot of states actually don't list out activities that imply you're conducting business. They will just list out all the activities that are not considered conducting business.
So what is the definition of conducting or doing business?
That's a great question, Mitzi. So the answer, put simply, is that you need to follow the state's registration guidelines. A lot of times that's a little confusing because the states will only tell you what they don't consider doing business, but then they won't tell you what is considered doing business. Like, for example, I do 10 transactions in a state. They're not going to give you anything with that much clarity. They just give you general guidelines on either what is or what isn't considered doing business. So consult with your CPA to make sure and be aware of, whatever types of transactions you may be having with your state, your home state, and other states that may trigger that you need to register your business with that state. So just consult with your CPA.
And so when do I need to register my business in another state? Is there a timeline for that?
Well, there is. It's a resounding before you start transacting business. So what does that mean? Well, we just define transacting business. However, some states do have a grace period. So, for example, I'm going to use Texas. Texas has a 90-day grace period after initially transacting business. So if you apply for business registration at any point during that time, they will not penalize you. Again, this is Texas. And Texas specifically does not define transacting business. Kind of like we talked before, they just give you 16 activities that do not constitute transacting business. And I'm just going to highlight a few things. For example, maintaining a bank account. If you just have a bank account in Texas, but your LLC somewhere else, Texas does not care. You can maintain your bank account in Texas. Another is conducting an isolated transaction. So for example, I just leased equipment one time to someone in the state of Texas. It was just a one and done. Texas would not consider that operating. And then another example is if you're just owning real estate or personal property in the state and that's all you're doing with it, you do not have to register in that business. Now you start to use the personal property or real estate, that's a different scenario.
So if I sell t-shirts all over the U.S., I'm selling to all 50 states, but I'm based in Texas and I'm shipping them. Mm-hmm. How does that work? Do I have to register the LLC in all 50 states?
So if we're talking about you're just based online,
right, an online retailer. Mm-hmm.
Right, so if you're based in Texas, you don't necessarily have to register in all 50 states. However, what may trigger a change in that is if you have employees in another state or you have a warehouse distribution center in another state. That is where you may want to look a little closer, consult your CPA, and see if you need to move forward with registering with that state. The bigger concern if you're an online retailer is sales tax. More and more states are looking to make sure they're getting their cut if things are sold in their state.
Right, and with sales tax, that depends on nexus. If you have nexus, which is generally a threshold of either sales within the states or transactions within the states. And when you reach that threshold, you would have nexus and then be required to file and remit the sales tax.
Yes. So if you're an online retailer, definitely look into that with your CPA because that's super important. But registering in the state does not necessarily go hand in hand with those requirements.
So Jessica, we see this a lot. And I know there are many LLCs out there that are not in compliance and not registered in the states where they need to be. What are some of the bigger consequences of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of the consequences may be that there's fines and penalties from the states that you were conducting business in. A pretty big one is putting your limited liability at risk. If you're already past the point of you're not qualified, maybe something is in process of happening, you may want to get with your lawyer to get ahead of that. But from our point, we want to make sure your limited liability is up to date and not at risk. So you're registered everywhere. Your company book is constantly getting review to make sure We just have the most up-to-date information in there to not put that limited liability at risk.
So Jessica, is there really any reason why I should set up an LLC in a different state than where I'm operating?
So you may have heard Delaware's a good state or any other state from a seminar, but there are only some very limited instances where that may be advised, but it's inefficient and unnecessary most of the time. So we advise that you register in your home state, and in that way you won't have to have 2 registered agents. You won't have to register in your own state as a foreign entity, and it just keeps things simpler, cleaner, easier to keep your LLC intact.
Well, Jessica, this was great info. This is one of those things we see all the time. So if this is you and you're in this boat and you're out of compliance and you know it, get with your local CPA and just get on top of this as soon as you can to help minimize and avoid these consequences. If you found today's video helpful, please do give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel. We do post new videos weekly. This has been Facts, Figures, and Fallacies from the Front Line, and thanks so much for tuning in.